Hello, I'm Miss Kroll, and I'm here to talk to you about a new subject in our unit. We are still in ancient Africa. Yay, my favorite. And today we're going to start talking about a new subject in ancient African history, and that is the Bantu migrations. So without further ado, let's go over to my PowerPoint. And away we go. So, Bantu migrations. So these are a series of migrations that occur between about 3000 or 2000 BCE and about the year 1500. So that's a huge time span. And the Bantu migrations are a language group of people, the Bantu language, and these are people who originate in this spot in Cameroon, um, which you can see on the map from where the first arrow and the dotted line arrow start. And they end up migrating during that period of time throughout the continent of Africa, and with that, they spread their language. And so we're going to talk about how we know they migrated, what were the results of their migrations, and learn how to look at history from a different lens in examining the Bantu migrations. So before we get going, I want to talk about different kinds of historical evidence that we have access to here as historians, as scholars. Obviously, we have textual evidence. So textual evidence can be secondary, written about some, like written, for example, if we're talking about Nubia, ancient Nubia, and we know that there is a language, Meroitic, that we haven't been able to translate yet. So we have all secondary sources, Romans writing about Nubia, Greeks writing about Nubia, Egyptians writing about Nubia, and that is textual evidence. If we were able to translate the Kingdom of Kush's Meroitic script, that would be first primary source textual evidence. We also have archaeological evidence. So this is the material culture that was left behind that we can dig up or examine visually. So the difficulty with archaeological evidence and Africa is that Africa was subjected to centuries of colonialism, which is a nice way of saying Europeans came and divided up land that was already owned by Africans, enslaved Africans, and redefined their cultural boundaries without thinking about the people who already lived there. So colonialism was essentially made it like pillaged or made it impossible to access different parts of history because it was either destroyed because of war or because of trying to access natural resources or whatever, or it was looted beyond ever being able to see. So things that we would have really liked to examine are gone from Africa, and that is in large part due to colonialism, oppression, and cultural looting. And so as far as Africa goes, archaeological evidence is a harder one to find. Not impossible, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in our next lecture, but colonialism made archaeological evidence on African continent sparse. So what we end up with when we're studying African history is we end up looking a lot at linguistic evidence. It's not a tangible thing, language. It's something that we all have a part of our everyday lives. We talk, we have a language, we speak, we communicate. And observing language patterns in the modern day can help inform us about what people lived there, what routes they took when they traveled, and then clue us into what we need to be looking for in these other types of historical evidence. So linguistic evidence is a really important kind of evidence, especially when you're dealing with a place that either had only secondary sources, because so in terms of textual evidence, a lot of African cultures, early African cultures, were they were not writing things down. They were speaking. There was oral traditions, and we'll learn a little bit more about that. But basically what we're dealing with is trying to figure out how to study Africa, because it's going to look different than the rest of the world, because it has been treated differently throughout history by the rest of the world. And because culturally, people are different. Africans relied for a long time on oral traditions. We know about oral traditions. Homer wrote the Iliad entirely from memory. He recited it. It wasn't written down until long after. But those hundreds and hundreds of pages, he would recite those from memory. So we know about oral traditions, and we know how deep and intellectually challenging oral traditions can be. So just because they weren't writing anything down does not mean that there wasn't a deep amount of culture happening there. We just have to look at these different kinds of evidence to learn about it. So about the Bantu people specifically, these are who we're going to be talking about today. The Bantu migrations, we're talking about the Bantu people moving throughout the continent of Africa in the ancient world, and what that did to change the way culture looked across the continent of Africa. Bantu literally means the people, and a lot of the cultures in West Africa, even East Africa, and throughout Central Africa today speak Bantu languages. We believe that this is directly attributed to the Bantu migrations. People are still speaking these languages today. Their origins are in modern-day Cameroon, as you can see on the map, and they spread in waves. So some basic facts about them: they believed in animism. Another really important fact that I touched on in the last slide is that there was no written work. It's not a literate society, and they had an oral tradition. So their history, their storytelling, everything was recorded and passed down orally, which is not an uncommon form for history to take in the ancient world. So their oral historians and storytellers were called griots, and they would be responsible for remembering the histories and all of the stories that go along with both the history of a group of people, of a culture, of a tribe, and the things that that culture believes about religion and what they want to teach their children. So that is a really important feature of the Bantu people, or the early Bantu people. And so with that, we know they're oral, and we're not going to find a lot of textual evidence. We'll find textual evidence about them, but not by them. So we have to resort to archaeological evidence, which there's not a lot of, and linguistic evidence, which is easier because people are still speaking Bantu languages today. Another important thing that the Bantu people bring with them is a knowledge of agriculture and ironworking. This is really important. They're one of the earliest people to be doing these things the way they're doing them. Because they have the knowledge of iron forging, their agriculture and their tools and their weapons are more sophisticated. So the way they relate to other tribes they run into as they migrate, these things will come into play. So one thing we have to understand about Africa is that its climate is highly, highly variable. And there are huge chunks of the African continent that are not inhabitable. So anywhere you see, I've put here, you don't have to write this down, but these are just like descriptions of the kinds of climates that you find in Africa. I just wanted this here to illustrate how diverse African ecology is. Now, in the areas on this map that you see desert, and the areas on this map that you see tropical rainforest, those are uninhabitable. So you can travel across the desert, but there's nothing there for people to live. And in tropical rainforests, there are deadly species of flies, particularly the say fly, which is still a big problem today, which makes it impossible to have livestock anywhere near those areas. And then obviously in deserts, there's no fertile soil, no source of water, nothing to sustain a culture, a society. So Africa is huge, it's vast, but the places that are inhabitable are these woodlands and these savannas. And then we have some other types of climates. You see the white areas are, I think, largely Mediterranean areas, but some highlands and other kinds of climate as well. But largely people are settling in the savannas. Here's the problem. This big chunk of yellow in the top quarter of the African continent, that's the Sahara Desert. And the Sahara Desert is continually expanding. So as the Sahara Desert expands, the Sahel, as they call it, there's less, it's forcing people out of that land and forcing them to migrate to another land. At the same time, as we can see in these areas, so the coasts are fine, but they become very quickly overcrowded. Savannas become very quickly overcrowded as well. And so these kinds of things where people are forced to congregate in these areas, obviously the resources get depleted. So in terms of migrations, when we talk about why people move, climate, geography, ecology, these things have a lot to do with it. This quote from a professor at the University of Botswana says, "When people move, they move for a reason. They move because the population is expanded. They move because the resources which support the population in the settlements have become inadequate. They move because there are changes to the climate, and they move for the sake of finding better areas in which to live." That seems pretty self-explanatory. People move, even in the modern day. Anyone who's a refugee, they didn't move because they just felt like moving. They moved because something pushed them out of their home, made it unsafe to live there, or impossible, like they don't have a home anymore. So when we think about immigrants and refugees in the modern world, it's important to keep this in mind. People move for a reason. People are forced out of their homes for a reason, not just because they feel like it. And when we think about migrations, particularly the Bantu migrations, let's think about something called push-pull factors. They're factors that either can push people out of an area or pull them into an area. For the Bantu migrations, what was pushing them out? Well, they were being pushed out by the population increase, which led to the depletion of resources, the expansion of the Sahara, and the resulting uninhabitable lands, rainforests and deserts, dense population in the north. So they were unable to inhabit these areas. There's no more agriculture that they can do. There's no more land for them to settle. And so as a result, they decide to start spreading into the rest of the continent. What's pulling them into the rest of the continent? Resources, particularly iron ore and hardwood, so that they can burn wood for their iron forges. And they're looking for, as we know, fertile land, always looking for fertile land. And the Bantu people are an agriculture-based people during this time period. So they need these resources. They depend on their iron forges. They depend on their agriculture. So they start to move. How do they move? So they're moving in sporadic migrations. So they're not moving all at once like an army going across the continent. They're going in small family groups, largely, or small community groups. They're need-based, so they don't move until they absolutely have to. But this shows how much this land in the north was getting uninhabitable because people are having to move during this time. The Bantu people are just one after another moving. How do we know about them moving? How do we know about the paths they took? Well, when the Bantu people migrated, they didn't just blaze ahead and not interact with the communities. So often their entering an area would result in the displacement of hunter-gatherers in that area. So any hunter-gatherers that had been inhabiting would be forced to move on because the Bantu people would settle that area, farm the land, and reappropriate all of the natural resources for their own use. So they displaced people as they moved, but they also assimilated into cultures that were already existing and absorbed those cultures into themselves. The Bantu people tend to absorb the cultures that they came in contact with because the Bantu people have a more sophisticated way of life, comparatively speaking. They have more sophisticated tools for farming. They have better weapons. They have the ability to forge iron, which is the earliest ability to forge iron in sub-Saharan Africa. And they end up interacting with and intermarrying with all of the places they come into contact with. So they leave a trace behind. The places that they go to become Bantu places, begin speaking Bantu languages. So how do we know about this? If we don't have written evidence, how do we know? So iron, just the mere existence of iron in these new areas of East and Southern Africa show that the Bantu people migrated there. No one in those areas was forging iron before they got there. So we know the point we can look at our archaeological evidence, see when the iron forges are dated to, and know, okay, that's when the Bantu people got there. Because no one was forging iron before that. Pottery. Very similar pottery styles. And we can see, again, same thing, traces. This is when the Bantu people got there. This is what their pottery looks like. And they decorated all of their pots. So that's very useful to us from an archaeological standpoint. And then in terms of linguistic evidence, this is the biggest thing that gets us talking about the Bantu migrations. There's studies that compare languages spoken in the modern day to languages spoken in a completely different part of Africa. And they share word similarities, they share prefixes, they share all kinds of language features that indicate, oh, so the people who lived here are somehow related to the people who lived here. How? Well, the people who migrated from here went through here and then ended up here. Does this make sense? It's really interesting to look at history in these different ways. So the first wave of migrations, this is from about 3000 or 2000 BCE to about 500 BCE. This is the one I want to focus on as kind of a case study. So they migrate into the area of Lake Victoria in modern day Uganda and Kenya. And the languages that are spoken in those areas today, including the tribal language that I learned when I was in the Peace Corps in Uganda, are Bantu languages. And so we can see that through intermarrying with the people who were already there, they learned what those people were doing, which was herding. So they were able to herd animals and domesticate animals after that point. And they also spread their language and culture, introduced better techniques for agriculture and systems of ironworking. And as they did, they displaced the hunter-gatherer groups in that area. So two languages that I've been looking at, and we'll have a video that tells you a little bit more about language similarities in different places, but I've been looking at the Igbo language in Nigeria and the language that I studied in Uganda, which was Olusamia. And there are some interesting similarities in the way the languages are spoken. If I can find my note. So Atutuoma means good morning in Igbo. Wasuziotia means how's your morning in Osamia. Now, it may sound a little hard to identify, but just the sounds that are being used are very similar. And there will be a video for you guys to take a look at that will show you kind of some of the different similarities that emerge in languages from Bantu speaking people. And that to me is really interesting. So, Webale Muno, which means thank you very much. Webale Muno Sebos Inyabos. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. I think that does it for my lecture. All right. Thank you guys.